Okay, thank you again for joining us for part 6 of documenting botanical diversity. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about drawing and field sketching. And so the first thing I want to say is that your drawings are for you. You don't have to worry about what other people think or if other people can tell what it is that you've drawn. I do a lot of teaching and students are always really hesitant to get started drawing plants. And then, they say, well, my drawings are terrible. No one will know what this is. And I just want to say it's such an amazing way to learn a plant is to be able to sit down and draw it. And through doing that, it really teaches you to see because it just forces you to look at every part of the plant. Our minds are sort of trained like, the flowers are colorful or, this is an interesting shape. It's easy to just kind of see some of the things when you look at a plant, but if you actually take the time to draw it, you start to notice the things like the way the petiole attaches to the axis and the angle of the leaves. And it really kind of clues you into all these details, and it can be really meditative. And for me, that has just been a really wonderful way to learn plants. And I hate to say it, since I've gotten a phone, I tend to do a lot more photographing plants and a lot less sketching plants in the field. But maybe someday I'll come back around and start doing more drawing and less photography. But lately, I admit I've been doing a lot more photography. So one of the ways that I really got involved with this is each time I saw a plant that I'd never seen before that was unfamiliar to me, I just take the time to sit down and try to sketch it out. So first time I went to the redwood forest, was just like blown away by all this diversity of ferns. I sat down and tried to sketch all these different plants. And at the time I didn't have a book or I didn't know their names. But I had those drawings and it's like, well, I could revisit these later and really get to know who these plants are. So I think we have a real tendency to think about plants just in the context of their names or their identification. And I think that's really useful. And it obviously being able to communicate with each other about plants, it's critical to have a name in a shared language, a common name or scientific name that we can communicate with other people. But there's also something that's really nice about just getting to know a plant as a fellow organism or a fellow being and taking the time to spend with it. So sometimes you'll draw a plant and then later you'll figure it out. And other times you just see something, pick it up off the forest floor and say, oh man, that is crazy. And you still don't know what it is. So another piece of advice is to take advantage of botanical gardens and herbaria. It's just such a wonderful way to spend the afternoon is to just go into a botanical garden with your sketchbook. All the plants have labels. All the plants have information on them to just sort of be able to go around. They're all really well watered. They're in excellent condition. Tons of different things are flowering. There's so much diversity. It's just a great way to take advantage of those collections. You can learn so much by just walking around a botanical garden and drawing, writing down plant names. So for years, that was just sort of my hobby and my botanical training was just to go to gardens and draw plants and write down their names. And a lot of that information kind of sticks, like just the act of drawing a plant and writing down its name and meditating on it is really helpful for retention. And then herbarium specimens, I may be biased and maybe I study ferns because they make such beautiful specimens, but there is something about that white background and the dark silhouette of the plant that's just so strikingly beautiful that it lends itself really well to drawing and is just sort of like a work of art in itself. So it is really fun to draw from herbarium specimens. And I think it makes you a better collector to focus on a specimen for that long and to kind of, you come to appreciate what makes a really nice specimen. If you take the time to slow down and draw it. And then, botanical gardens, again, just have all these beautiful collections of all these things and this peaceful scenery and these awesome sort of landscapes. This is the bromeliad collection from the Botanical Garden in Ciudad Bolivar in Venezuela. And then also, if you're taking your sketchbook around, you don't have to get too fancy. This is actually, my tool of choice is a ballpoint pen. Like I don't think they're 19 cents anymore, but I think they're less than $1. You can, pick them up for free at the dentist or wherever you go. And you can just have such an amazing quality of line weight. You could, get really dark darks and really light lights. So I really love ballpoint pen. I also have hands that I tend to smear graphite. So I always hated drawing with pencil. And I love the ballpoint pen. It was nice to sometimes just trying to get a landscape shot, thinking about a sense of place or sense of ecosystem type, incorporating some landscapes along with your sketches be really fun. And then just taking advantage of the page, having a composition that, you're taking along this small little notebook, and it's like, well, you can open it up and use both pages. And it's nice to just sort of think about composition, think about the way that you want to use the page, and thinking about overlapping and drawing different things together, combining your own notes and observations with plants. And I've done some botanical illustration, and when I'm approaching a botanical illustration, it's always this is sort of a formal thing. It's supposed to look really clean and clear. It's like an idealized perfect specimen, and you have multiple views of different things that are really relevant. But sometimes it's nice to just say, well, I'm going to draw this dead curling leaf that has been eaten by a caterpillar, or the germinating seed is not really something you'd include in an illustration, that would be diagnostic. Botanical illustration is usually you want to identify something, and it's just like, oh, well, these are, the flowers in bud. So an empty half of a legume fruit. So it's fun to just draw plants as you see them, as they are, and in kind of an informal way. And then also just having side-by-side comparisons can be really nice. It's also nice to try to do field dissections, just like thumbnail dissections. I don't, have a razor blade or a knife or something, and taking one of these, taking something apart, seeing how it's put together inside. So this is a snapdragon fruit. And there's something about, taking this thing apart and looking at the inside and, trying to draw it a little bit bigger than actual size and understand how the seeds are positioned within the fruit. And I got to say, like with Plantagenaceae, their fruits have a look to them that is kind of universal within that family. So it's like, I remember drawing this fruit, and when I see another relative or member of this family, it is familiar to me because I just remember doing this study of this individual fruit. So taking the time to really get to know a plant and do this careful drawing, it just helps you build the sense of familiarity and recognizing that plant again when you see it. And here's another, this is just a cool, a really cool plant. Like this flower is just awesome. Like it's just one giant petal that's rolled kind of like a taco. It was just sort of a crazy thing. So, I'll just try to take that apart and draw its constituent parts and try to see how is that thing put together, like such a unique, beautiful flower. And then noticing there's these little glands that are right at the base of the leaflet. So it's just kind of nice to, take a page and do an exploration of a plant and try to capture all the different parts and maybe focus on little studies of the details that have these really memorable features. And that's one of the things that's really easy to overlook when you just are looking at a plant is not noticing the architecture of the way the leaves connect to the stem or something like that. So really taking the time to focus on those sorts of details can be really satisfying. It's nice too, just having, you know, again, just a ballpoint drawing, but then a little bit of color added in, and just trying to, you know, thinking about this really thick, chunky gesneriad stem, and just, you know, trying to feel the weight of that and remember, you know, the thickness of the leaves. And this was sort of fun, you know, just seeing this plant coming up out of the moss, and it was like, it, you know, it kind of looked like two separate ferns, you know, one with a simple leaf and one with a compound leaf. And it's just like, oh wait, that's all just one, that's all one plant with dimorphic leaves, and, you know, pulling it up by the rhizome and saying, oh, that's really, you know, interesting. So doing these little studies of the things that catch your attention and the moths that come around. And this is another, you know, this is not the sort of thing I would ever do in a botanical illustration, but it was fascinating being in this forest during a drought. And all these epiphytic ferns were all drying up in their own kind of unique ways. You know, and noticing like some of them were folding up towards the top, some of them were folding towards the bottom, or they were rolling. And this is an elaphoglossum that just like curled up in a spiral. And so when it, you know, the rains come back and it rehydrates, it'll sort of come out. So these are the sort of things you don't capture on an herbarium specimen, and you might not pick up on, and, you know, it's not at its most beautiful, perfect state. But it's just interesting to kind of pick up on these idiosyncrasies of the way plants behave under different conditions. And I kind of like using a mid-tone. I have some mid-tone sketchbooks, so you can have like the dark and bring out some light highlights, can be kind of fun. This is just done with an ink wash. So doing a watercolor with basically just black ink. Well, it's really nice for doing a study of bark or doing the shape of a trunk of a tree. So this is a big old open grown American beech from northern Michigan. And then, you know, working really tight, getting some details, and then it's just nice to sort of to loosen up and be a little bit more, you know, quick and loose with brush strokes, and try to capture something like a, you know, the big open feathery branches of a white pine. And then this is just to give you a little sense of, you know, when I'm doing something more formal of an illustration, I'll start with like a really rough sketch, like this thumbnail that's just sort of like, well, how am I going to put this composition on the page? So if you're thinking about having a more final drawing, it's nice to kind of do these quick little studies and keep track of, wait, which specimen was that? Which specimen was this? So I have, you know, sketchbooks with all these sort of thumbnail, trying to put together compositions. And then this is a pen and ink drawing. So I'm old school with the well of ink and the quill pen. And this is kind of what the raw scan looks like. So once, that's a really nice thing about working with black and white, is once you can kind of process the image and pull out the darks and the lights, you can really get these beautiful bold lines that reduce really well. And then I just go ahead and add the, you know, the boundaries and scale bars and letters and something for a more complete figure. And so this is just an example of some of the more formal botanical illustrations with pen and ink. But this is something I like to do when I'm sketching too, is just having like a habit of the plant, or like the larger view, and then focusing in on some of the details that are important or could be diagnostic, or, you know, different sorts of close-ups. So that's sort of a fun thing to do just in your sketchbook, is having, you know, trying to draw the habit of the plant, and then also focusing on some of the details. And then this is from my master's work in Honduras, was studying the ecology of a neotropical savanna and looking at the disturbance regimes. And this is just such an interesting ecosystem, because it was subject to routine hurricanes. So it was basically at or below sea level. So it's like a sawgrass prairie with Telmatoblechnum serulatum, this salt-tolerant fern in these big savanna with these clumps of palm, Acelorrhaphe wrightii. And so it was an ecosystem that was prone to hurricanes and kind of salt and disturbance tolerant. It also would flood. It would have sort of an extreme wet season and an extreme dry season. So had major fluctuations, was being inundated and then drying down. And then in addition to these seasonal fluctuations, it was actually the groundwater would shift throughout the day with the tide. So depending on what time of day it was, the ground could be wet or it could be dry. So you have all these kind of crazy disturbances. And then maybe once every 5 years or so, a fire would come through. So part of my research interest was trying to understand the dynamics in this ecosystem and understand succession. And so, trying to draw that and understand it was really helpful for me. So this is right after a fire has gone through, and it's basically burned off all the tops of the palms, burned off it's Cladium jamaicense, the sawgrass, and the Telmatoblechnum ferns. And then those fires burn so hot, and the leaves that accumulate around the palms, it actually burns into the soil. So the peat, the organic soil layer itself, is burned. And then it starts to fill back in with water. And then in this sort of like burned moat around this clump of palm trees, you get this amazing diversity of carnivorous plants, and all these little dicanthelia, little grasses start growing in there, Utricularia, Drosera, some cool melastomes all popping up in this wetland, lots of sedges. And then the Acelorrhaphe, it's a cool thing about palm trees or monocots in general is that the vascular bundles are scattered throughout the tissue of the plant. So it's not like girdling a maple tree or something. Those plants can kind of regrow, even though they're just totally charred on the outside. And they have these massive underground storage organs called lignotubers that re-sprout. So just seeing this whole ecosystem sort of coming back to life, and this huge diversity of things that move into this now inundated low spot where the organic soil burned away around the palms. And then meanwhile, the Telmatoblechnum and the sawgrass is starting to grow back and beginning to encroach. And then it ends up, finishing the cycle and returning to something that looked like its original state. So it's just kind of fun to have, keep track of these things. It sort of lends itself to a comic book format of, hypothesizing about the succession of vegetation based on seeing evidence from current fires and patterns of diversity across the landscape. So here's just one more example of trying to incorporate ecological hypotheses with seeing plants distributed on the landscape. So this is an example. I did a study of Asplenium viridie, which is green spleenwort, and the walking fern, Asplenium rhizophyllum. And so we're seeing this kind of distinct pattern where Asplenium viridie tend to grow really low on boulders, and then the walking fern was kind of on the upper parts of boulders. And so just wondering about the sort of spatial segregation of these two species that sometimes grew, within centimeters of each other, but were often sort of spaced apart. So these box and whisker plots are basically showing the median lowest height of a population versus the upper height. Here's the median. These are divided into quartiles for Asplenium viridie and then for Asplenium rhizophyllum. And this is a 10 centimeter scale here. And so what we were finding is in a typical year in the winter, a lot of the Asplenium viridie would actually be underneath the snow. And then we were finding a lot of evidence of herbivory from white-tailed deer. And in some places, the Asplenium rhizophyllum seemed to be growing just above the height of a typical white-tailed deer. So we actually tried a transplant experiment onto a lower boulder and came back the following year, and those plants had been sort of eaten away. So it's what we think is sort of an abiotic and biotic interaction that is driving the spatial segregation of these ferns on the landscape. So it's just a fun thing to try to draw to try to communicate the story about our hypothesis of these ferns. So, and was fun too. This was another pandemic project. Is my dissertation. I worked closely with Alan Smith, also curator of ferns at Berkeley, on a taxonomic monograph. And this was again during the pandemic lockdown, just walking around and noticing these beautiful fall colors of like this is Thalipteris palustris, which happens to be the type species for the family Thalipteridaceae. Those were turning this beautiful kind of pale yellow chartreuse and had a lot of, you know, the decaying vegetation in the background that really made them pop. So it's, you know, captures this kind of moment in time of the fall of 2020, when I was trying to finish the book and doing these long hikes and watching all the fall colors change. So that made the cover of our book. And then another thing that I've been really into recently is doing some pottery. And so I mentioned, you know, herbarium specimens are just the most beautiful examples. You just have this awesome silhouette of a plant or some sort of a design. So this is a sketch of a Chenactus done in the field, and then kind of experimenting with like, well, this is a latex painted on top of one glaze, and then, you know, another glaze over top, and the latex removed and fired. So it's been fun to kind of incorporate my love of botany and all these observations, all these cool plants I see into making mugs. So here's one some of you may recognize. And then again, these were just, you know, really based on herbarium specimens of plants, so that, you know, just this beautiful silhouette that lend themselves really well to design. So that's been kind of a fun thing lately. So got a little bit more informal there and going through my sketchbook, but happy to talk about drawing or any other questions you might have. Thank you.